Okay. All right. We are back. Another episode of Political Theory and other stuff. Today we are doing our overview on capitalist realism by Mark Fisher. It's super exciting because we have a guest today, our first guest ever. And Mr. Guest, will you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Chris. Should I just say some stuff about myself?
Yeah, say some stuff about yourself.
First, I know Mike and Paul from high school. We hung out way back in the day. Now I live in New York. I'm a graduate student in English at the Graduate Center. And I'm trying to write my dissertation now about finance and contemporary culture. And there's a whole lot of shit I could say about that, but maybe later.
Excellent.
Awesome.
And
thank you so much.
yeah, thanks for coming. We really appreciate it, Chris.
Yeah, happy to be here.
And you're obviously familiar with the work that we're reviewing today. Do you want to talk about maybe how you came across it and maybe initial impressions or something?
Sure. So I think I first read this in 2013, when was it published? I'm just looking up in 2009. Okay. So I read it in 2013, which was around the time that like Occupy was happening. And for me, that was the time when I started sort of getting into kind of like leftist or radical politics or whatever. And a lot of that came through just like reading blogs. And Mark Fisher's blog, K-Punk, was one of the first ones I started reading. And the thing I remember most about it was at that time, most of what I read, I had like no idea what he was talking about. So it was just like, oh, he's talking about techno, but he's also talking about like political economy and like the legal economy. And I'm just like, what the fuck is going on here? But it seems really cool. And then I found this book because like everybody was talking about it on like the blogosphere or whatever. And it was just like really formative in terms of trying to think about ideology and just sort of like this sense that there's no getting out of it, no kind of opting in or out, right? It's just this like pervasive kind of like everything is fucked, like what can we do about it? And I feel like the book, and it's just like so accessible, right? It's not written like an academic book or like a scholarly book necessarily, but it certainly invokes all kinds of like scholarly concepts and cites things, et cetera, but it's just like really approachable. And so I think that experience was the same for like a lot of people around that time. And because it's also like 80 pages, I'm like, cool, I can read this in an afternoon. So for a long time, it was like super, super important for how I thought about the world. And now coming back to it, it seems really interesting how much of like a document of its time it is, that sort of like Obama era, where everything like, was still obviously super fucked, but there was still this like really pervasive sense that like nothing is going to change. This is just going to keep going on and on and on. And I think especially like post 2016, some of the stuff in here like feels a lot more dated to me. And maybe we can talk about some of that stuff as we go.
Yeah, absolutely. So Paul and I read the book together. It was my second full reading of the book. I realized as we were reading it how much I overlooked or didn't fully comprehend while I was doing this reading with Paul. I found some of it, or a lot of it, very very striking, but I also have some questions, and I don't know how much, if the amount I felt about it being a product of its time was relative or equal to yours. I feel like maybe it was less, but there were moments where I was like, I wonder if he would have approached this topic differently if this had been written a decade or so later. Sorry.
And it just comes up with like, for me, with the topical things that he picks, like the way he discusses the internet, the way he discusses how kids behave. We had those discussions while we were reading it, where I was like, I'm not sure if that went exactly the route he thought it would, or if the base understanding of how this would grow came clear in some of those sections as far as like, that's when I was like, oh man, still topical points. And like, if you expound upon it, a lot of it was still pretty relevant. But, that's I think, kind of some of the price he paid for trying to be as relevant as possible while he was writing it.
Yeah, and it's like that's the danger, I guess, of like writing about culture ever, is like culture's kind of always changing so rapidly. Like that's one of the things I think is really great about this book, is the way that he uses popular culture as a way of analyzing these sort of more abstract, more kind of like diffuse, complicated things. Yeah, it'd be interesting because and I think that's like what's most valuable here, and what he was like best at is that sort of cultural analysis. And it's just like such a bummer that he died, because it would be so useful to hear how he is working with like all the weird cultural shit that we're dealing with today,
Yeah. And Paul and I talked about that with a lot of the movies, especially when he was talking about like Born and Memento, and there was another one, like how he was able to tie in the idea of like whatever cultural amnesia to those movies. I didn't save the excerpts, but I remember while we were reading it just being like, damn dude, I have seen those movies multiple times and I never would have been able to make that connection to like the greater cultural movements. And I think that's, like you were saying, incredibly valuable.
Yeah, for sure.
So one thing that I've been wondering about is he talks early on about how during the capitalist realist like epoch or whatever, we're not able to like come up with new things, and like everything is just like recycled and reformatted. Paul and I have talked about that kind of being a little bit skeptical of that. The thing that came to recently, I saw this show called Midnight Gospel, and I was thinking as I was watching it, like I wish I could hear what Fisher would say about this, because to me this seems like a new show. Or am I missing what he means by recycled? Am I taking it too literally? Or do you have any input on that?
Well, I've watched a couple episodes of the show.
Okay.
And it seems interesting to me because, as far as I understand, it's like a podcast with some like animations and stuff.
Yep.
Right. So it seems like there's already something like a little bit kind of recycled about that. Like I don't think recycled is even like
necessarily bad.
Pejorative here.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, like Fisher himself was super into like DJ music, right? Which is like constantly recycling things. I think the sense that there's nothing new is maybe more of kind of like a political statement than like a formal one. Like there could be something formally innovative about what is it? Midnight Gospel. Yeah. But that it's still sort of like routed through all these kind of like modes of consumption and all that like everything else is, right? Like it's at the end of the day, it's still just like a fucking Netflix show, right? And the idea that any of these Netflix shows are going to like bring about some sort of new consciousness or something, maybe that's the thing that he's kind of trying to question.
Okay. All right. Okay. That makes sense.
My kind of interpretation of the whole thing is that, one, this comes to me a little bit about kind of some of that outdated stuff, which is that I'm not sure while this book was written that he could have fully predicted, and I'm not saying it's going to be a long-term version of this, but the extremity of the decentralization of media or entertainment, like YouTube, podcasts. To me, maybe it's not new, but it is really different because these all got to come out without any corporate oversight. There wasn't a larger entity dictating what's like with us. We're a podcast. Sure, maybe we don't have a lot of listeners, but there is nobody guiding what we can and can't say on our production of media. And I think a lot of that happened through YouTube and podcasts in general. Now, in defense of his whole concept, it does seem like that's getting backtracked on. Like YouTube is globulating or whatever word, it's coming back into that. Okay, there's a few main channels, they are very dictated in what they say. You know, a lot of their content is based on keeping sponsors happy. And the same is happening to the podcasting world. But that isn't to say that, you know, same with Twitch. Twitch is getting a little bit more corporatized and things of that nature. But that concept that there can be a deregulation of media, I think is slightly new, at least in my lifetime, or how I interpret it. And that's what I like about Midnight Gospel, is that like clearly it was allowed to be made without having some like giant audience pre-built. Like I'm not sure, you know, who they would have sold as far as ad dollars would have gone if it had gone to like CBS or whatever. Yeah, like it's for me, just the idea that a show like that could exist without having like an endless marketing scheme to it, or the fact that it doesn't need to pump out new episodes, that kind of concept is a little, I think, new as far as media went from the time even when this book was written.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think he would say that like newness is like constantly being generated, right? That's like people are always trying to like do cool new shit. But it's that kind of, I'm sure there's like a technical term he uses, but I can't remember what. But the way it's sort of like subsumed under this whole like apparatus that it seems like now is happening with like pod. Like, didn't Joe Rogan get like $100 million or something from Spotify? And like Joe Rogan is kind of like the emblem of that, like, nobody can tell me what to think. Like, I'm just asking questions, blah, blah, blah. I'm sort of like free
Nobody
thought.
can even tell me to think. No,
right, yeah. And it got like, that's always happening. And it does, like, podcasts are one potentially like cool source of that. But it's part of a process. And it seems like that process towards concentration, centralization, right, in the sort of like market Stalinist sense that he talks about. Where it's all capital all the time, right?
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And
to be
it
super
also,
real.
Yeah.
Sorry. If we ever wanted to extend our reach, we would need capital. There's no question about it. Like, regardless of.
Right. And the other thing I think of when he's talking about like capital being like John Carpenter film The Thing, and how it just like you have this explosion of something slightly different or whatever with like the internet or then like YouTube or podcasts or Twitch. And then over time, The Thing is able to incorporate it back in. And that's something that capital is maybe one of the things it's best at, is kind of consuming and incorporating things that were once either in opposition to it or independent, or seemed independent of it, you know. And we obviously see that also with the Bono's like Project Red or whatever it was called, you know, that sort of thing in general. That's fascinating to me.
And it, like when he talks about Nirvana and Kurt Cobain, so like Cobain sort of confronted this problem like head on. Like, I want to make sort of this anti-establishment music, but like I'm the establishment now. So all I can do is sort of like say fuck you to myself. And like that's the only option left, you know?
Yeah.
And just one thing I thought about while reading that is like how many people that ends up not bothering. Obviously that had a lasting effect on Kurt Cobain, but there are so many people who start anti-establishment, and you know, the second you get money, you're out of it. And I'm going on a huge tangent, you can edit this out, but I always think about that Black Mirror episode where they all like ride bikes to like power their society. Do you guys know what I'm talking about at all?
No, I haven't
okay, so it ends like it focuses on a guy who's very upset with the way that the whole thing works. A tragedy kind of befalls him because of the system, and the whole thing is kind of like based around like to get out of riding the bike, you have to win this like American talent or the American Idol kind of show. Okay, and so he works his way onto the show. And instead of doing an act, he like grabs the microphone and like just fucking rails on how shitty the society is and how shitty everybody is, just watching people's grief and stuff. And he ends up winning and is given a show where he can now go on and just say those things afterwards. And the end of it is he no longer cares how shitty the society is. He has a beautiful house, servants, all the food and shit he could eat. And once a week he gets on and like for 30 minutes pretends to be angry still. And that is like such a good representation of what Mark Fisher is talking about, or what happened, you know, in that situation.
Totally.
Have you guys seen Network?
No,
That,
I
like,
haven't, but it's on my
no.
list. I've
Okay.
wanted to
Yeah,
see
it's
it.
great. But I mean, it's different than that. But it's still about the sort of like commodification of this like outrage, because there's the famous scene where he's like, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. We start
Right.
saying that on the news, and all the execs are like, what the fuck? We can't have this on the news. And then this woman is like, no, wait, this is exactly what we need on the news. And it becomes this whole production where he ends up killing himself on air, but it like more viewers than ever before, you know? So it all,
Right.
again, just gets like sucked back into.
Funneled money back into the system he was mad at.
Yeah. And that's that concept of like, what if you had a protest and everybody showed up, right? It's like,
good call.
if everybody's into it, then
It's not.
yeah.
That kind of ties in. I did a few, I think it's 6. I have 6 quotes that resonated for me, and this ties into one of them. So I just want to, like, bottom page 12 and kind of the bottom of page 13. And I'm actually going to like read them opposite than how it's written. He says, this is him talking about some Zizek shit, and he says, so long as we believe in our hearts that capitalism is bad, we are free to continue to participate in capitalist exchange. And then on page 12, he's talking about Wally, and he says, the film performs our anti-capitalism for us, allowing us to continue to consume with impunity. That just like really strikes a chord. I mean, I've just felt, I've experienced that so many times where I'm able to justify my consumption or my participation through, or the product does something for me to alleviate my anxiety about participating in capital. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I just thought that is striking to me.
I'm just trying to think about like the phrasing of like consuming this cultural product or whatever, and that being like alleviating your anxiety. And I just like, do you think that, so if you watch quote unquote like anti-capitalist film or show or whatever, like is that the primary effect of like alleviation?
No, but I was thinking, and maybe this doesn't even like necessarily tie in, but like the whole we were talking about like Tom's, the shoes, fucking
Right.
a while back when Paul and I were recording. Like I remember times where it's like, I don't necessarily need an extra pair of shoes right now, but it would be nice to have like a lighter pair of shoes for summer. These people are giving shoes away, so I'm like helping out by getting these shoes. So I'm going to get not one pair of shoes, I'm getting 2 different pairs of shoes, 2 different colors. That was what I was kind of alluding to. Not that when I watch, something about the problems with capital or read something about it, it's like, oh, okay, now I feel better because I've done this. I mean, I do, but that has more to do about like feeling a little bit more informed than it does feeling like I'm fixing something by purchasing something. That's what it comes down to, is like feeling like I have made the problem a little less bad by purchasing something, which I feel like it's pretty clear that that's not the case. In fact, I would say that it's not the case. But for whatever reason, the marketing, the PR has at times in my life been able to trick me into thinking that I'm doing something good by purchasing stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah. But I just wonder about like alleviation as kind of like a lessening or of some like negative state versus the sort of more positive effects of like feeling more informed or feeling like angry or that you understand something better about like how the world is fucked up, which those seem like sort of different operations. And again, like I don't know that anybody like watches Wall-E and like gets angry, right? And I think that's like why he uses
the point. Right.
Like,
yeah.
You watch Wall-E and you're like, oh, great, like cool.
Yeah.
So that does seem to be like some kind of alleviation when you're like, I recognize that this is our world covered in trash and shit and like it's fucked, but like I feel better about it,
Yeah.
We can still have a love story in that world, though.
Is
what we focus on.
Yeah, and all the fucking fat people can like get out of their chairs and like start doing shit again and return to Earth and plant seeds or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally.
it's for me what Wally gets at, and it's kind of mentioned here, is that like the concept, that one of the concepts that blew my mind is that it seems, or it's hinted that media has just turned to the, well, we're not going to get out of this. Like, we're fucked anyway. So we need to start making shows, not about how we save this, but about how people live past the apocalypse. And that kind of depresses me. And I see it. Once I read that in this book, I started thinking about all of the things that fall into that category, especially, you know, I don't want to just pin it straight to the zombie thing because I'm not super educated about this topic, but that seemed to be a starting point where now so many movies and so many TV shows are set in a post-apocalyptic warning literally every time about like how our lives are. Obviously with the suggestion that we can't fix this, we just have to hope that once we blow this all up, there'll be some people hanging out afterwards that learn from our mistakes or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. And I think Fisher was like, I mean, that was happening before he was writing this, and certainly like for the rest of his life. But yeah, and it's that kind of like, so instead of sort of this like shiny like Jetsons utopia of the 90s, you get these sort of like dark, grimy, like survivalist fantasies, right? And yeah, definitely. And all of those I feel like are like always about this kind of like individualist, like, I need to be prepared, you know? Yeah, which again is like just fucking pure ideology. And there is something like so attractive about that, and that's like why it works ideologically. You know, like, I'm gonna be the fucking like the clever one who outsmarts the zombies, you know?
Yes. Yep. Yeah. And all these things that were holding me back are no longer holding me back. I can reach my true potential of manhood.
Right. That kind of freedom that comes like after all the fucking sheep are dead, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And I've had this talk with a lot of people who are super into like surviving it. And I'm like, well, I'm glad you guys are into this because I sure as fuck just hope I don't make it to the other side. Like, I don't want my life to instantly turn into me like battling renegades in my fucking woods while scavenging fucking rabbit parts and shit. Like, that's not my personal utopia.
Like, another like instance of that I've been really interested in lately is like in sci-fi, where it's for, you know, the sort of general thrust of sci-fi is like you go out and explore the stars, colonize planets and all this shit. But now I feel like more and more these films, books, whatever, are about like going out into space and be like, oh shit, it sucks out here. Like, we gotta go back. Oh shit, the Earth sucks too. Like, what the fuck are we supposed to do? So instead of this sort of just like, you know, colonizing imperative or whatever, and this obviously has a lot to do with climate change, but the idea that like we're stuck here and like the situation is deteriorating rapidly and like we have to do something about it. But what, you know? And that's
So when you were talking about like with the sci-fi and being like, well, what are we gonna do? That reminded me of the quote on like top of page 35. It says there is no longer any identifiable external enemy. The consequence is Marazi. I think, how'd you say that dude's name? Do you know?
Maratz? He's a Christian Maratzi.
Okay,
Maratzi.
Maratzi argues that post-Fordist workers are like the Old Testament Jews after they left the house of slavery, liberated from a bondage to which they have no wish to return, but also abandoned, stranded in the desert, confused about the way forward. When Paul and I were reading this, I got like choked up reading that because I do often just feel so helpless as far as what needs to happen on a big scale. And you talking about sci-fi and how it's so now there's this trend of like not knowing, finding that the stars are not where they want to be, but also returning isn't an option or isn't a good one. Just reminded me of that. So that's why I wanted to bring that up too.
Yeah, it's just the sense of the whole book. And I guess that's where I still feel uncomfortable with so many things, is that like, and that's what Mark Fisher is pointing out, I think, with the term capitalist realism and the whole thing, is like the whole world has just decided that there isn't another option, that like this is the end all be all of how we can function and that there's not going to be a next step. And I guess what always gets me down is that in a lot of conversations, I myself personally can identify problems, but sure can't lay like a beautiful path forward of what needs to happen. Like, I understand in my head that I would way rather live in a world where your merit isn't a capital-based system, where everything about you isn't based off of your bank account or your assets. Then I can very much feel that people would be happier. But I don't know how to express like a turnkey operation about how we switch away from that. Like, how do we revalue everything? How do we rearrange everything? And in my head, I can tell myself, well, I just think stronger bureaucratic processes with people more vetted into those processes could help. But that's, like a kind of like a pipe dream and doesn't really explain stuff. And so that is where, like you were saying, I just feel lost, because like I see that there's a problem, but I don't know how to get us out of the desert.
Earlier today, I was just like reading some stuff about Fisher and about the book, and there was an article in Jacobin saying like, if only Fisher had lived to see like Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, like he would have been super pumped and like, oh, this is the way out. And it was written in 2019, so it kind of like, oh, and then you like would have lived to see both of those dudes just like swept away with like casual wave of the hands, So, but even in his own writings, like on his blog and in some other things, it seems like there is a kind of faith in that sort of like political process, right? Like with sort of mass mobilizations, like a proper movement, we can get good people in leadership positions who can help like lead us out of this mess. And that's that I am deeply skeptical of. Well, I mean, I like understand it completely, and it seems like a very sort of plausible answer to that, like, what is to be done question. Work to get good people into positions of power. I would also just kind of like following up on the Jacobin article, like I would also be very interested not only what Fisher would have said about the sort of Corbyn and Sanders phenomenon, which seemed on the verge of like real power, but also the aftermath in which it became so fucking clear that like that power was just like pure illusion, like fucking Obama and the DNC just one day were like enough of this shit, get out of here. And it fucking happens, despite like the greatest, most fucking like efficiently organized, like enthusiastic campaign organization like ever, So
and it's just like the hard part about that is there is like a part of me that is like, don't you guys just see the monolith that Trump supporters are? Like, can't we emulate that? But then the large part of me is like, but that's not a movement I want to be a part of either. Like I don't want to tell people that they can't have dissenting opinions, but how do you battle against something where that is how they behave? Like every day, and I don't mean to be so topical, but I just get, like, I live in the southeastern United States, and the amount of anger towards just trying to uphold public safety protocols is insane. Like, and there's no logic to be talked. You can't bring up numbers, because if you talk about people dead, any comparison is just not a relevant comparison. And you're talking about a virus that kills 0.00002% of the population. And the only reason that I can't back that up is because every number published is fake. And while I know that's fake, and you do also know that fake, but pretend to acknowledge it. And it's such a, I don't know how you combat that, like that team spirit sort of shit. I really.
Mike and I have talked a lot about this kind of shit, sort of the alt-right and this, which I think to most people generally have like fucking insane beliefs and convictions. And I feel like I have actually been like more dismissive of it than I should have been, whereas Mike has always been like, no, dude, you need to fucking take these dudes seriously. And again, like, especially during the coronavirus stuff. and maybe it's just like confirmation bias or whatever, but it's just like, and I know it's that because it's all the vast majority of people are like, yeah, wear masks, like social distance.
That's very true.
You don't want people to die. But you do get like caught up in the narrative that there's this like vast swath of people who are like freedom, which means, you know, getting your haircut or not suffering the injury to manhood that like wearing a mask would entail.
Right.
You know? Which again is just like pure fucking insanity. But there is something at like the heart of that it seems like we have to reckon with, you know? Like what is so attractive about this to so many people?
Yeah,
I think it's guns.
And
well, like, I'm not kidding.
It's definitely just a bunch of people like want to fuck their guns, you know.
Yeah, I also like
that.
A concept I think about all the time is it's just like, damn, dude, these are all people who should have been playing D&D, but instead of being into like fantasy worlds, they construct this fantasy about the reality they live in, and so they buy all of these guns and all of these things for this looming conflict where they can't even identify the enemy. Like the enemy is the deep state cabal that everybody who is wearing a mask is a part of. Like the North Carolina, the lady in charge of all the stay-at-home protests, dude, her husband is constantly publishing shit about like, well, we're not saying that the guns are there to kill you, but if you bring guns, you better be careful. Just shit like that. It's like, hold on, what are you talking about? Nobody is shooting each other in the streets right now. Like this is a fantasy in your head.
Well, I mean, people are being shot in the streets,
yes,
but they're
not
black
them.
people being shot by cops, which like,
yeah,
these people don't give a shit about, you know,
Right.
because it doesn't, conform to that kind of like survivalist fantasy. Because the black people are the ones that they're gonna have to like defend their family against or whatever, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I will say, you know, I just finished for my first time a couple weeks ago reading a Chomsky book, Manufacturing Consent. You know what? Really, it's so good and yet so frustrating. Because it's, for me, Paul and I have talked about this, and this happens a lot with when you're tackling that sort of topic where, to me, because of the literature I've been exposed to, it's pretty obvious that that the media and journalists unconsciously would conform to the corporate and government narrative, you know, but to attempt to convince someone else of that, you need to bring a lot of facts, and you need to bring a lot of examples of this happening. So the book has to beat, in my opinion, a dead horse on the topic, if that makes sense. Like the amount of, and it's really cool for someone that's like that's skeptical on the topic, but for me, it was like, dude, you know, this is like the 12th example, and I appreciate the work that you've done to make these examples. But anyhow, the striking thing about the protests and how it feels like there's like so many people that believe this is, I saw somewhere that the amount of like strikes doubles or triples the amount of these like conservative protests, but the media covers the protests, I can't remember, but a magnitude more. And that's like such a good example of the manufacturing consent. It makes it seem like everyone wants to get back to business, that everyone values the economy and capital more than they value human life, when in reality, like we were saying, it's a small minority, you know. Even out of, I assume, and I haven't looked at the numbers, but even out of conservatives, I would assume it's only a subset of conservatives that are out there protesting the stay-at-home orders.
Yeah,
it sucks. They so strategically live in a way that allows them to swing presidential elections.
I know.
Like, even, I don't think that, like, they're particularly strategic in a way that, like, you know, leftists aren't or something. It's just their actions like provoke outrage in a way that like fuels the media cycle, whereas like a bunch of people, you know, like picketing a factory, a school, a store, whatever, like, isn't that exciting?
Right.
As a bunch of fucking people with like bazookas, like American flag tank tops, that's some shit that you want to watch, you know. Oh, I want to see these fucking freaks, you know. And again, that seems like the whole kind of like, that's Trump, right? Like, he's just like perfect fucking fodder for this like constant stream of outrage and exposure and all this shit. And like, how are we, like the left's gonna do that kind of shit? Again, that doesn't. I don't even know that that's like a productive question. It's just
Right.
Like,
Yeah, it's true.
Like,
And
the constant media cycle.
and there's that, there, like I said, a small group with unwavering ability or with unwavering opinions can be really effective, because that is one of, I think that's why a lot of us here have shifted left, is that it is more of an open dialogue. Like, I'm not going to support Obama just because he was theoretically closer to my ideological framework than somebody else, if he's still extremely outside of my ideological framework. That's why Al Franken doesn't have a job anymore.
Yeah.
And, Trump is still president, is because the left in general, and I'm doing a huge broad American left, not even like, leftist ideals, but just, the American DNC, while surely not holding everybody accountable, will allow itself to be fractured for ideological frameworks. And the other side just doesn't even have a framework. They will jump to whatever they need to be or feel like they are correct, or at least together with each other.
The DNC, I like wouldn't conflate the DNC
Right, with left.
I'm just talking like American left, because we don't have any like actual leftist politicians. Maybe
right, or really even a party for them to even exist in.
To me, that's always seemed like the kind of like openness of that movement, right? Where it can, like, you can be this like, financial Jew as like super elite or whatever, and you can also like be a fucking Nazi who like wants to exterminate all. That there's a kind of ideology there that's just like just pure trolling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that seems to be like the kind of driving motive, is this dissatisfaction with the way things are and the kind of desire to like, go against whatever that thing is. Sometimes it can be like anti-Semitism, that'll like rile people up. And again, none of this is to say that like there aren't like genuine fucking like, Nazi true believers. Like that's obviously very much the case. But just in order to account for like its influence as a movement or something, it seems more likely that people are just like, whatever I can do, to like distinguish myself from, the sheep or whatever.
Yep.
So
Yep.
I'm going to be anti-Semitic. I'm going to be whatever the fucking topic, right now it's like Bill Gates.
Right. Yeah. It's a lot of it.
You're a free thinker. Like,
Yep.
you show that you're anti-Bill Gates. And like, Bill Gates fucking sucks, but
Right.
none of these people like have any fucking idea why. They're just like,
Right. They're mad about microchips and vaccines,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
about
billionaires and philanthropy and whatnot.
Right, exactly.
But I'm going to shoehorn in another
Yes,
quote.
please.
Because on page 60, he references Wendy Brown and this Wendy Brown essay called American Nightmare, Neoconservatism, Neoliberalism, and the Democratization. I feel like that kind of ties into what we're talking about how can all of these different or seemingly different ideologies on the right coalesce and work together. Paul, would you mind just reading from where it says Brown unpicked down to the end of her quote on the next page, 61?
Not a problem. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Brown unpicked the alliance between neoconservatism and neoliberalism, which constituted the American version of capitalist realism up until 2008. Brown shows that neoliberalism and neoconservatism operated from premises which are not only inconsistent, but directly contradictory. How, Brown asks, beginning the quote, does a rationality that is expressly amoral at the level of both ends and means, parentheses neoliberalism, intersect with one that is expressly moral and regulatory, neoconservatism? How does a project that empties the world of meaning, that cheapens and deracinates life and openly exploits desire, intersect one centered on fixing and enforcing meanings, conserving certain ways of life, and repressing and regulating desire? How does support for governance modeled on the firm and a normative social fabric of self-interest marry or jostle against support for governance modeled on church authority and a normative social fabric of self-sacrifice and long-term filial loyalty, the very fabric shredded by unbridled capitalism?
I like the quote because it is just so crazy how these things are so seemingly opposed and yet able to find ways to align.
Yeah, no, you're
Yeah.
right. It is like this is such a
One thing I've
descriptive.
never thought of is I wonder how much the alt-right is a consequence of these two things. Because post-Reagan, neoliberals and Republicans didn't have a lot of differences. And so I wonder if that right felt the need to distinguish it by going that hectic to establish like a difference, even though essentially the legislative purposes are the same.
Well, I mean, I know that for a lot of the alt-right kind of figureheads, people like Richard Spencer and Mike Enoch. I can't remember the other hosts of the Daily Show, but those dudes often talk about how like they are in a lot of ways anti-capitalist too, because they see how neoliberalism has failed people, but for them, white people. So there's like a distrust for neoliberalism and globalism, you know, and that kind of ties into something else I wanted to say. I'm sorry that I'm
No,
shoving
please.
everything in here. So on 70, where is it? Okay, yeah, on 79, end of the book, or close to the end of the book, the bottom of the last paragraph, he says, or the first paragraph, he says, anti-capitalism must oppose capital's globalism with its own authentic universality. That made me, when I was reading that made me think of, first of all, how there are a lot of people on the right now that are somewhat anti-capitalist and are isolationists when it comes to trade because of their distrust of neoliberalism, but how I also see that to a certain extent on the left when it comes to certain SOCDEM candidates. Like I feel like Bernie talked a little bit about isolationism, about like bringing back factory jobs to the US and maintaining those things. And I think that although I can see the allure of that rhetoric, at least for the short term, as far as like procuring votes, I do feel like that is counterproductive for the leftist project long term, because if you are focusing on, when you talk about economic isolationism, it's really easy then for in my opinion, when I look at history, for there to be a growth of then nationalism and xenophobia to come from that. How do you feel about that? Is that a fair assessment of economic isolationism?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that to me seems like a deeply pernicious segments of the left. And I think, like, you're right, a lot of it, I mean, and it's not even like hidden or unconscious necessarily. There's the same kind of like xenophobia and like fear of that sort of other, you know, brown mass of people there that is like on the alt-right. But they justify it through like labor theory of value or whatever. And, you know, without like getting into the weeds of that or the theory or anything, I think is like based on a real like misunderstanding of like how labor markets work, but it's also like, okay, so what we want to protect is the value of American labor, and one way we do that is by like keeping out all the, you know, poor masses who will reduce that value. Like, is that a fucking like world that we want to live in, you know?
Right.
Even if those ends, like, sure, like pay workers more, of course we all want that, right? But like, what are the means by which like we arrive at that thing? And if those means are something like a sort of isolationism, xenophobia, exclusion of immigrants or whatever, it might be worth asking, like, well, is getting workers paid more the thing we actually want here? And yeah, there's, you know, a sort of whole other conversation we could have about like labor theory of value and that idea that the goal here is to have workers get the value of their labor in some way, right? It's like, it seems like a thing a lot of people are really into, versus the idea that value itself is sort of like constituted by the specific form of labor that exists under capitalism, and that it's like that we want to do away with. Which again, like, how do we get there?
For sure.
Right.
To play like a little devil's advocate, I could say that from some positions, I could almost understand a slight economic isolation, like you said, in the goal of ending more exploitation, as long as it's not coupled with any sort of cultural isolation. Like if you were able to say like, hey, as American companies, if you're going to, Germany kind of has a somewhat similar model. If you're going to use foreign labor, you have to pay American wages over there. Or we're going to stop relying on Chinese labor, but we're going to open up our borders so that anybody who can qualify for these jobs can do them. Obviously, those are real world scenarios that could never actually work. You know, I feel like if we were like, hey, American companies, you have to pay Chinese employees what you pay Americans, that the end result would be the American wage going down. I feel, you know, like if you opened up jobs to more immigrants, then the backlash of the xenophobic, like they took our jobs, would be monumental. So I think I can understand a rationale behind it. Like, hey, our goal is to stop exploiting Chinese immigrants, but I don't know how to couple that reality or that idea with the actual reality of how the world would respond to such a move. And I think that, like you said, that's where their big problem is like, I can see where your ideas are, but it seems like you didn't think that through past why these would be good,
Yeah.
opposed.
And even like, let's say we do, like, you know, Bernie in this alternate universe becomes president, passes some legislation that says like, you know, we're pro-immigration, but you have to pay wages, fair wages to all the immigrants. They're still like relying on a kind of legal framework that you assume is going to like actually work, right? But it doesn't ever, you know? And that's like all of the immigrant labor that's like still very much flooding into this country, despite Trump being, you know, the most like anti-immigrant president ever or whatever. Like all of that shit is off the books. It has nothing to do with like the minimum wage or whatever. And that's been the case forever. Like capital has always relied on the one hand on this sort of like freely exchanged labor power that like workers enter into contracts with their employers, blah, blah, blah. But also on this like vast unpaid, you know, labor force. That you don't have to pay attention to because it's illegal, it's unnoticed, it's unseen, whatever. Sure, raise the minimum wage, right? But that doesn't solve that problem.
No. And I honestly, sorry, I don't have any facts to back this per se. So if I'm being real stupid, just cut me now. I honestly tend to think that is why the right pushes immigration laws. Or one of the reasons the right pushes immigration laws so much is tons of large corporations illegally use immigrant labor. And part of the way they're able to keep that secret is how afraid the immigrants are. Like the immigrant knows that there's no way he can ever admit that he's an immigrant or talk about his story because their fucking family will end up in cages. So I often see that as more of a way to oppress, like the stronger the immigration law is, the more they're oppressed in their lives as American citizens. The more they have to be afraid, the more they can be exploited because they know they're in a position where at any second, everything can be instantly taken away from them. My mother was a social worker and for a very wealthy county. And one of the things that happened in her term there was finding out that a lot of houses there were no exaggeration, had brought in immigrant help, not let them renew any of their visas, and were basically keeping them in their houses as like indentured servants, not allowing them to like go. This is a town that is very, very synonymous with being extremely, extremely wealthy. And that it was not like a 1 or 2 off case. It ended up being like a very large scale FBI, CBI kind of investigation.
Holy shit, dude.
Yeah. And I only think that's possible in a place where immigration laws are fucking draconian because they can't. There's no place for them to go to for help.
Yeah, at my university, maybe like a year ago or something, there was a conference and this dude who was like organizing agricultural workers in Florida, I think. They were orange pickers or something. Was telling us all about the just, and like everybody knows this, but just the insane like fucking abuses that these people have to go to exactly because they have like no legal recourse, no sort of sense of like rights or whatever. That's just like horrific story, just like rape and abuse, and there's, nothing they can do about it because it's still like the fucking $2 a day that they're getting to like pick tomatoes for whatever giant agriculture. It's like still more money than they would get working in their home country. So yeah, I don't know. I guess all of this is just sort of testament to maybe what was one of your original points, Mike, about
Yeah,
the need for a kind of universality, or perhaps like an international approach to this, which again, it seems like the sort of isolationist, protectionist people, I mean, they like gesture at, but it's basically like, do a revolution in your own country, please.
right.
Like, we're trying to do one in ours, which seems like a really, really bad approach to this,
Right. Yeah. Totally. This is my last quote, and I'd like to touch base on it, and then we can wrap things up. This is important to me. Okay, so one of the left's vices is its endless rehearsal of this is 78, bottom of 78. And it says, one of the left's vices is its endless rehearsal of historical debates, its tendency to keep going over Kronstadt or the new economic policy rather than planning and organizing for a future that it really believes in. The failure of previous forms of anti-capitalist political organization should not be a cause for despair. But what needs to be left behind is a certain romantic attachment to the politics of failure, to the comfortable position of a defeated marginality. I see this especially because I don't spend a lot of time in leftist circles in the real world. The spaces I'm predominantly in are internet based, and I see this. I think it's very pernicious online. This, like I was talking to Paul, and I think I've talked to Chris about this as well. I used to listen to this podcast that they would literally like use the bleep that they use on TV shows to censor profanity, but they would do it for like Trotsky or like Trotskyites, right? So people would be talking and Trotsky's name would come up and it would just be like beep, because these people are like, whatever, like Stalinists or whatever. To me, that feels so much A, more like performative, and B, it feels more like they are wedded to almost like something that feels more akin to like a subculture. We are metalheads and we hate punk rock, rather than something more serious as far as like we're trying to build a political movement. I know that's probably, as far as the radical left goes, probably a small subset of the community, but especially like on Twitter and Discord and Reddit, I just see it all kinds of sectarian infighting and debates about shit that happened like 70, 80 years ago. And although history is important and we do need to be involved in historical knowledge and whatnot, I think that we need to reject the temptation to engage in sparring over past sectarian happenings.
Yeah. I wonder though about, how did you put it? This like we're Stalinists and we hate Trotsky, and that being sort of like identity or like a group you join.
Yep.
And I just wonder, to what extent is it possible for there to be something like a left movement that isn't like that kind of identity,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's like wading into the fucking identity waters, very perilous. But it's like these things are inevitable, right? And I mean, I guess not to the sort of extreme extent that like I'm gonna bleep out Trotsky because whatever, like there are very good reasons for that, I'm sure. But that no matter what, right? It's like you are going to kind of like align yourself. Like I'm with these people, like I'm with these. And I don't know that is that a problem that needs to be like overcome, or?
Well, I think that I don't know, but instinctually or on a gut level, it feels like there doesn't have to be unity, meaning we don't have to agree on everything, but there should be solidarity in the sense that I understand that when push comes to shove, a Trotskyite is my comrade,
Right.
and we need to work together. I still have problems with him, and I'm not saying me personally, but anyone that hates Trotskyites or dislikes them, I still have a problem with them ideologically, but they are my comrade. I feel like that is useful. I think that is something that we should move towards, because our numbers are weak as it is, and that level of infighting, I mean, it is important to, when you have an ideological difference with a group or whatever, to voice that, but also to, in my opinion, to be there, to not prioritize infighting over the leftist goal. You get what I'm saying? Like, I do feel like you were saying, some people feel, or some groups I feel like are so much more comfortable just being just marginalized and accustomed to failure, rather than trying to move forward.
Like, maybe save the infighting until you actually have something to actually fight about. Like, we're so on the fringes right now, and we're fighting about realities that are so far away from happening that maybe we could focus on getting an actual cohesive reality.
One thing I've noticed on Twitter, so like, who cares, but it's fun to talk about. Like, all of the like hardcore tanky, like pro-Assad people have become like hardcore coronavirus conspiracy theorists.
Really?
Yeah, which is so funny. So now they're like citing all these like fucking insane like alt-right dudes like talking about Bill Gates, when like 3 months ago they were talking about like the fucking glorious like People's Army of Assad needs to like wipe out the fucking white helmets or whatever. Which again, all of it like, but it just like, it's this kind of contrarian everything that seems like, and you know, the people who like bleep out Trotsky, like, to me just seems like a kind of contrarian, you know, like, okay, well, whatever the masses, right? And the masses, I guess, confined in the sense to like whatever minuscule portion of the country is like the left, like, we're fucking against that, you know?
Yeah.
And it seems like that's the kind of like affective investment there. It's just like, I'm way over here. You guys are all over here. I'm like fucking way over here, you know?
And that's like an issue with fringe or radical things in general, is that you're going to have some people who really believe in it and have reasons for why they're there. But it's also an attractive thing, like you were saying, just to the trolling community, because it is a concept that pushes the regular masses away, and anything, you know, so it attracts people that just want to rile feathers, as opposed to having any ideological agreements, I think.
Yeah, which like as sort of a like motive for action, behavior, whatever, it just seems like inescapable now. Like, that's the only reason anybody does anything anymore, is because they like want to piss off some like undefined group of other people.
Right, exactly, that undefinable other. I was watching I've been watching some Hulu show about cults, and that is just a theme that comes up in it so often, where the like interviewer is like, so who is this other person you guys are preparing against? And they just can't fucking answer. They have no answer, but they don't care. The only other thing I kind of want to talk about is just I don't have a single quote because he brings it up a few times, but just that concept of, if businesses can't be ran as businesses, which all of these economic turmoil has proven that like the business model we rely on isn't, you know, tenable for a large scale, then why do these people feel so comfortable in demanding that a government is ran as a business? And I think that is a weak point that could actually be exploited. Like, if we were to highlight if it was able to enter like the common sphere of like how unreliable the business model is, how hectic it is, how wasteful it is, that it would back that argument out a lot. But I don't really know how to get that across, and I have tried in a lot of Reddit arguments.
Yeah. What do you mean? But what do you mean by businesses? They're not able to. Be
so the main places he brings that up, I think, would be the '08 bank bailouts. Like, if these businesses can't even survive acting as businesses, how can you demand that the government and the society that you function in is also operated in the same way? When time after time, it has been proven that without regulation and allowing businesses to operate exactly how they feel is right, you know, like post the ending of like Glass-Steagall and stuff like that was like, well, these government regulations, and then what does it do? It leads to a gigantic economy or a collapse of the economy. But I don't understand why it's so hard to hammer that point across. Like, look at like, this is what you want our company or our country to run out has, like exhausting all of its funds every 20 years because of stupid, not thought out choices and shit like that. And I feel like that is a point that would almost be, out of everything, one of the easier ways to highlight is like, hold on, your whole ideology is based off of this falsehood. But how do you do it without getting them defensive in the first place? Like,
well, yeah. Well, and I think that the contradictions in capitalism have always existed, and that's why they need stuff like bailouts occasionally or whatever.
Right. And it just blows my mind that those things have happened multiple times in my lifetime, but they're skirted over so easily. And I guess
like
that's the
ignored.
whole point of the book.
Yeah. Well, and that's the whole thing with like the ahistorical stuff and the amnesia, is being able to ignore those truths.
Just bums me out, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. It just like seems important to distinguish too between something like a financial crisis and something like what we are experiencing now, which is just sort of like a generalized depression.
Right.
Because like the logic for, or their logic for 2008 was that it was like a black swan event, right? This kind of unforeseeable, just sort of like eruption of like random circumstances, which is fucking bullshit.
Bullshit, right.
But that's there like reams and reams of like economic evidence. But even without that, like we can just look at the recovery in which the financial markets like are doing like twice as good as they were before 2008. The GDP is going up, et cetera, et cetera. And it seems to be like there's these metrics now for sort of economic health that are just kind of like totally detached from
reality.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of reality, right? It's like a sort of like abstract financial rate. Like the GDP is actually going up, right? Like the markets are actually skyrocketing. The fact that like unemployment's at almost 40%, like everybody's been fucked forever, is like a different kind of reality that again seems to have no relation to this sort of like dominant one that exists now. But it's like amazing how powerful that narrative is. Because like even, you know, I'll talk to my dad, who's like, you know, not like a fucking communist or anything, but it's like strong, liberal, whatever. Just be like, yeah, you know, the economy's been basically like tanking since, you know, the early 1970s. And he's like, no way. Like, look at the GDP.
Look at my 401k.
Yeah, and that kind of stuff too. That sort of like individualized, internalized kind of like investment in, you know, the market. But that shit is just like so powerful, and the way these like metrics get kind of deployed to suggest health, to suggest prosperity, growth, whatever.
Or the classic argument of like, how could you be poor and own an iPhone?
Sure.
Yeah. You know, like that huge disconnect between like, sorry, I'm probably not talking about what you're talking about, but that huge disconnect between like the argument I get so often is, if we were poor, how could you buy a new iPhone every year? And it's that disconnect between like, yeah, globalism has made a lot of products cheap enough for poor people to own while also not being able to afford rent or afford healthcare. And somehow those aren't analogous. Like they could afford rent and healthcare if they didn't make that one-time purchase once a year. And it's so far from reality. The only reason they can make that purchase is because iPhones are cheap as fuck because of globalism.
Well, and also credit.
Credit,
Which again, like post, you know, early 70s, like the American economy like is just credit and debt. But it's also like the iPhone, and in one of the quotes Flav mentioned earlier about this sort of like post-Fordist economy, like entering the labor force now is kind of like impossible without an iPhone, you know?
Yeah.
So it's not just like, look at you like playing your fucking, I don't know, what's a game on the iPhone? Candy Crush. No, you're fucking like answering furious emails from your boss on there all day.
Applying for jobs. Good luck applying for a job without, you know, an iPhone or a laptop.
Yeah. Oh, I guess maybe it's just sort of like going back to what I mentioned earlier about the book feeling like a little bit dated.
Oh yeah, we didn't really cover that really. Did
Yeah.
you should cover that before we wrap things up.
So to me, it's actually kind of the central thesis, this idea, which goes back to like the 80s or whatever, the Tina, there is no alternative kind of idea, that we can't imagine anything other than capitalism. Like that actually seems a little bit dated to me now. And I think that has less to do with any sort of like imaginative capacities that people have like developed or lost or whatever, and more to do with just the fact that like we are all witnessing this system like crumbling before our eyes right now. Like everybody fucking knows it. And there are these fantasies of kind of like, you know, oh, if we elect Biden or whatever, AOC in like 2024, everything can go back to being like good and cool again as it was in like the Obama years, which of course it wasn't. And it seems like more and more people are kind of like realizing this and recognizing this, that that is just a fucking pure fantasy, you know. And that's like this whole thing is going down and is going to continue to go down, and that's something we have to confront. And the ways we confront that are sort of where all the contests lie now, right? So there's a kind of like nationalist, xenophobic, racist versus these other sort of like array of approaches on the left. But that idea that like we can't imagine anything other than capitalism, it seems like right now all we can imagine are things other than capitalism, right? And they could be like disastrous and apocalyptic, or they could be kind of like utopian. But that just seems like something that people are like being forced to confront more and more, and not like academics or like organizers or activists or whatever, but just like regular ass people. And the coronavirus crisis seems like just sort of like the most forceful example of that. And obviously these crises are going to continue to happen, but you know, like 40% fucking unemployment is insane, right? Like as just a material change in people's lives. And right now, like people are getting unemployment, which is sick, but like that's gonna run out, you know? All your restaurants are gonna close, all your fucking stores are gonna be gone, all your old relatives are gonna fucking die. Like it just like it's impossible to kind of confront, to not confront this failure now in a way that this book seems to say like we weren't then, which again like makes sense in the context.
I guess my only response to that is I do get worried that we're just going to enter like hyper capitalism after this.
Sure.
Just from a shock doctrine sort of perspective, like watching what Betsy DeVos is doing with public schools, watching what they're doing with now how federal money goes to states, watching all of these things where like, probably I'm reaching too far, but Trump's like pulling a Putin right now where every day I read articles about a new purse whose strings were now tied by McConnell or Trump. So it's getting to the point where like, even the governors that are not Republican and don't support Trump find themselves in this weird fucking position where they have to pay some weird lip service, or like I live in a part of North Carolina, and watching Roy Cooper having to maneuver around the fact that Trump has now dried up all federal things unless you agree to open up at the rate he wants you to open up at. I do get worried that we're going to come out of this, and while we're paying attention to the coronavirus, not see everything they gutted while government officials weren't in office, while people were staying at home. So I do worry about that as well, that while we're talking about how it's not working, that the powers that be are coming in and making sure that nothing but hyper-capitalism will.
Yeah. And like that seems like clearly the most likely outcome of all of this. But it also, like, I don't think that then entails a kind of like new sort of stasis in which we just have this like capitalism but worse, and then that's just how things are.
That's true.
And it seems like all of this, and again the sort of just like blatant, like, forget fucking ideology, like we're just gonna talk about people as like human capital now, right?
Literally
all of the sort of like sheen and gloss over everything is gone, and they're like, we're just gonna fucking like loot this shit before it goes down. But again, and I feel like you can tell this from sort of just listening to like the ruling class, like they know it's going down. That's true. All of this is just like the kind of spasm of like a dying body. So whatever comes after that, again, is like, anybody's guess, and it does seem likely that it's just going to be like fucking horrific. But I just like the idea that we can go back to any kind of stability as a country. I think it's just kind of like ignoring all kinds of things.
Reality. No, that's really true. I think about that too, because I'm not a scientist. I just read them. But it seems that the coronavirus may be kind of the tip of tragedy after tragedy occurring because of what we have done. And the thing about coronavirus that is different than, the narrative that can be controlled by a terrorist attack is that you can't just push it away. Tomorrow there will be more dead people, and the day after there will be more dead people. And I guess now we're just playing the game. Like, what does that number have to reach before people have to acknowledge that it's a reality?
Like that's what they seem to be setting us up for. Is like the whole sort of reopening movement is like, all right, 10,000 people a day are gonna die. That's just life,
They were gonna die anyway. You knew you were gonna die. What are you shocked about?
Like it's not even worth like rehearsing all the
No, it's true.
stupid arguments. But have you guys read Mike Davis talking about this situation? No, you should.
But
if I get to do a pitch here.
Yes.
So Mike Davis wrote a book on pandemics like ages ago. And has written stuff more recently about this, but it's just like the smartest motherfucker. And like one of the things he says is that, like you said, Paul, this is just like the tip of the iceberg. It's an effect, a consequence of global warming, and deforestation and all kinds of sort of like natural symbioses just being like totally disrupted. But it's gonna get worse. Not even like, obviously climate change as a whole is gonna make things worse, but even specifically just like diseases, viruses, that kind of shit, like that's going to keep happening. And like part of the there is no alternative capitalist realism framework, it seems like very closely connected to the sort of end of history thesis, right? And that's like, more time, right? Everything is just the same. And it's like so clear to me that we're out of that. We're back in history now,
Yeah,
like,
that's good call.
Crazy shit is happening every single day that seemed like totally unimaginable 15 years ago,
Yeah.
And one thing that I guess people with our ideologies can be careful of, and please disagree if I'm wrong, is being sure to be welcoming on the other end too. Because that is one thing that I see alt-writers do in their internet communities. Holy shit, are they welcoming if you say one of their taglines. Like you're instantly in on their right side. Whereas like, Mike talks about bleeping out Trotsky and shit. We don't have that welcoming vibe on our side where it's like, oh, that's cute, you think that, but you need to read for 10 more years before you can even talk to me.
Say anything. Yeah.
There's did you guys read the Vampire's Castle essay?
No. Yeah.
That one is basically making that point that I know, Mike, you and I have talked a lot about this, but the problem on the left of this kind of like harsh gatekeeping, like all the other words for it. Yeah, and I mean, I think it's well argued. It seems pretty conclusive that there is this kind of problem where, like, I just hate saying virtue signaling because it's like such a meaningless term. But this idea that like one must sort of demonstrate their, virtue through the kind of like harshest possible critique. But as you and I have talked about, Mike, like I do think sometimes that gets blown out of proportion because we're all so fucking online,
Yeah.
Totally. Oh God.
Yeah.
But maybe that's not like a adequate dismissal of it, because I don't know. But I guess I'm agreeing. Like it does seem like a thing that people could work on generally.
Yeah. It doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt. It's not. I don't see any downsides. All right. So we've been going at it. I think that we covered at least the things I wanted to cover. I think the takeaway for anyone listening that didn't listen to our episodes on the book is that it is worth reading. There are concepts that are definitely worth exploring and investigating. And I do feel like it is a good entry point into a lot of topics and concepts. It was incredible being able to have Chris come and talk with us. We really appreciate it. And
Thank you very much.
yeah, and hopefully, we can convince you to do the same in the future.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, no, you killed it.
Okay.
Yeah.
100%.
Go
Cool.
for it, Paul.
Have a great day.